Welcome back. In part one of this video, we looked at how we can restore a scanned slide, even a poor quality one like this, and turn it into something much more acceptable like this one using the special tools available. And in this part two, we're going to look at how we can turn scanned prints or images downloaded from the internet like this one into a remarkable restored print like this. So let's dive in and get started.
Now, when it comes to flatbed scanners, there are lots and lots on the market, but what you really want to look for is one that has a good quality, not necessarily a combination with other functions, but a good scanner that will give you quite good results. This is a Canon scanner, and some of the scanners come with really good software, but for consistency we're going to use the same software for scanning with this scanner as we're using for the film scanning. So obviously with the scanning from a print, you're going to place it into the scanner and then use the software settings to try and get the best quality we can. And so we'll have a look at that now using the same software.
So we used the ViewScan software with the film scanner, and we'll use the same software for scanning from our prints. Now, many of the flatbed scanners come with really good software, but for consistency we're going to use this one. But if your flatbed scanner doesn't have all of these options, it might be worth your while looking at a third-party piece of software. Now, we're still using the professional standard. There is also a combination printer connected to this, and that's not what we want. We want the CanaScan flatbed scanner. Now, the monochrome image that I put in there, normally you would expect to scan it in just black and white, but because we want to maximize the amount of data we've got available, we're going to scan it as a color image, 20-foot RGB. And typically with a print, especially old prints, they would really be lucky to be more than 200 dpi, probably even less than that. But for the purposes of scanning, we want to try and maximize the detail we can extract from it. So I'm going to scan at 600 dpi. That gives us a lot more data than we really need, but it helps when we come to try and restore the image. So basically all of the other options are going to be the same. We're not going to crop it until we have a preview on it. We're going to look at, we're not going to restore colors because the color in this image doesn't really matter, but we might look at seeing if it can restore fading, reduce the medium level of grain reduction. We're not going to sharpen it at all. And then the color adjustment we're going to leave as is. We're going to scan it to a ProPhoto RGB color space, and we're going to again scan it as a raw file. So let's have a quick look at the preview. This particular image that I'm scanning is in fact a print made from a poor quality scan of an old photograph. So it's a second generation image, and it's not very well done. And you can see there's a lot of damage on this because it was mounted behind glass, and some of the emulsion is stuck to the glass when the image was removed. So we've got a fair bit of work to do to restore it. But this gives us an idea of a really bad example and just how far we can go with restoring old images. And we'll use another couple of examples later to show you typically older style photographs that you might have in your archives. So with that preview scan, you'll see now that it's adjusted the color for us. We don't really care because this is not a color image, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the crop level just so it's a little bit outside the image area, just so we've got a little bit of room to move later on when we come to crop it. And you'll see here that the white balance has been adjusted because this was quite a warm sepia tone print, and now the background is looking a little bit blue. That doesn't really matter because it's going to end up a monochrome image, but what we want is the best quality possible. So with that all set, we go ahead and scan the image at our 600 pixels per inch, and we'll take it then into the software and have a look and see what we can do with it. And again, the scanning takes just a little bit of time, and if you don't get a satisfactory scan the first time around, by all means do it again and try some other settings to see if it can improve your base data, because the better quality data you've got going into the software, the better quality result we're going to have. And I've chosen this one because it has a number of serious problems that we will try and resolve, and you'll see at the end how much better we can make it and whether that is acceptable or not. And we'll have a look at a few further examples as we go through. So we'll just let that scan and then we'll take it into the software. And of course, if you end up with a photograph that's too large for a scanner, most flatbed scanners are up to A4 size, you may have to go to the option of rephotographing an old print. And at least using a modern digital camera, you can photograph it at good resolution, but you need to be careful about how you set that up. And it's not going to be covered in this video, but if you do have a really large print, that's probably your only option if it's larger than this sort of size print. So here we are, having opened that scanned print into Lightroom, and you can see here that we've scanned it and it's overall fairly light. There was no detail in pretty much any part of this image, but you can see here all this really bad damage. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go and move it into some adjustments within Lightroom, and we'll move over to the Develop module, and let's go back and have a look at what I did. I've already done this. I created a virtual copy, and of course the first thing I would do is I would make some adjustments to this exposure. You'll see here I brought it down about half a stop, just to bring back some of that shadow detail. There's not a lot of detail in a lot of these shadows, but then I would have adjusted the blacks down a little further just to try and bring these darker points down. You'll see here, adjusted the exposure again, bring it back a little bit more, and then tweak the blacks just a tiny bit more. And now we'll take that into Photoshop and have a look at how we can get rid of all of this terrible mess and fix that up. So we'll move into Photoshop now. So here we are back in Photoshop. This is a copy of the raw file, the DNG file with those Lightroom adjustments, and over here we have another version where I've made all of my adjustments and fixed up all the problems. Now I won't go through all of these in the same detail as I did with the slides because some of it is the same, but essentially what we did first was we went into make a duplicate layer and applied the denoise filter. Now on this particular image, very little difference made, just took away some of the graininess in the image, but then we went into another copy of the layer with the denoise applied and applied the sharpen AI, and here it is trying to bring back a little bit of the detail, particularly around the eyes and the nose. And you'll see when I turn this back on, there is a slight improvement. It is getting it a little bit more grainy and introducing some artifacts, which we'll try and solve that a little bit later, but it's trying to bring back some detail. Now the next thing that we have a problem with is that on this part of the image there is absolutely no detail whatsoever. So to correct that, I do a thing that I call the recovering of the highlights, and what it's done is it's basically put in a little bit of the same color background as you would have in the rest of the face. And to do this, simply what I do is I go into select, color range, and I select, rather than select sampled colors, I'm selecting the highlights, and you'll see here we have a slider for both fuzziness and the range, and I really want to just pick out the really brightest part of the image, which is this side of his face, and I don't worry too much about his collar. Make a selection of that, and then I apply that selection to a curves layer. You'll see here this is now the curves layer, and what we do with that curves layer is we change the blend mode to multiply, and you'll see instantly that it's darkened all of that down. And with this selection active, if I hold down the Alt key, click on the mask, you'll see that I've got a very precise looking mask. What I want to do is with that I want to feather that quite a bit because I just want to soften those edges. I don't want a harsh line, and so I would move that feathering to a point about somewhere about there, so that my darkening down of the image is not totally obvious, and we've brought back not any detail, but we've put a little bit of color back in there. We still have a problem with the fault with the emulsion here. We'll fix that up a little bit later on, but that's how I would do that, and I've made an action for that that I called Recover Highlights, and there it is there. And then I would go now with this image into Nik again, and in this case Silver Efex Pro, and let's just go into that. Nik Silver Efex Pro, and in this particular case I can't bring out a lot of detail in the with the high structure filter, because there's not a lot there, and it just makes this horrible. But what I will do is I'll go into the full dynamic smooth option, which gives me a little bit more detail, but I'm going to need to play around with these sliders to bring back some of that detail. I don't want those whites amplified really much at all, and I don't want to play with the blacks too much. And so with any of these filters you've got a lot of adjustments built in, and so by adjusting the image to suit, I'm trying to bring back some of the detail and just enhance what I've got there. Now something like that, we'll apply that image, and here it is here. Now I did this earlier, so we'll just go back to my earlier version, and full detail smooth modified was the one I used, and you'll see here that now we've got a monochrome image. I've left this blended at 100% normal blend mode because this isn't a monochrome image, and it's starting to look a little bit better, but I've still got all of these problems here. And what I would do to solve that is I'll make a separate layer, and using the Content Aware Fill I can select an area here and use that. So let's just have a look at that and see how that works. Using the lasso tool, large areas where there's a problem with the information, I can draw a line around it, and let's say, well, let's take all of this area and fill it. So with that active, we go to the Edit menu, Content Aware Fill, and depending on, we'll just get rid of that Nik menu, depending on where it's going to select from, here is a preview of how it's going to treat it. We don't want it sampling the man's face or the suit, so we just remove those from the area that it's sampling, and then we'll get another result. And if it doesn't work the first time, you can usually try a couple of different versions and it will do a much better job. We don't want to be sampling from the other damaged areas or his face. And so with that active, you'll see now that the proposed solution is looking pretty good, and you can play around and adjust that multiple times. And so you've now got a layer here with the filled amount in. It's not perfect here, but we can use the clone tool to fill that in. Now I've already done this once before, so let's just go back to that. I'll use the select tool to deselect. We've now got a little bit of a defect there still, and I'll go back and I'll make another version of that and fill those in, and over a number of steps we'll fill bits and pieces in. Now to fix up this problem with this side of the image, what I did was I made a selection of the lapel area, copied it and pasted it back over there, and then flipped it and blended it in. And you'll see if I disable the layer mask, here's the piece that I copied from this side. I flipped it over there. I then applied a little bit of a blur to it, and then with my mask I've painted in the edge to just soften that a little bit, so that I've got a little bit more of a realistic looking side of the jacket. And then using a series of cloning and patching tools, using the patch tool and the clone tool on another layer, I've brought those details back in and tried to repair that as much as possible. This all takes quite a lot of time, but essentially you can spend as much time as you like working on this, and then I've just made another small adjustment there. It's looking a lot better, but we still have a little bit of work we can do to this. And the next thing I did was I used another curves adjustment to darken the whole image down. If you look at this, you see I've darkened the whole image down, but using a mask I've painted out around his eyes and mouth because they were already quite dark. I didn't want to darken those down anymore, but it's given it a little bit more definition and darkened things down. And then I decided that it was a little bit too dark there, so I added another curves layer to lighten around his eyes, inverted the mask, and then just painted white in there to lighten around the eyes, and so that's brought back a little bit more in the eyes area. And then I was still unhappy with this bottom part of the photograph because it's rather badly damaged and also out of focus. So what I did was I made another curves adjustment, quite a savage darkening adjustment, and again with the mask inverted, I've just painted white into part of that with a soft edge brush just to darken that edge of the suit down so that it doesn't draw our eye away. And then I realized that this background was looking a bit ugly, so what I've done is I made a duplicate layer of everything that I've done below, and I've applied a blur filter to that. But what I did was I made a selection of the man and I painted out around his head, so that all I've done is just soften that background area using the Gaussian blur filter within Photoshop, and again adjusting the settings to suit. That has brought that background well out of focus and still usable. And then just applying some small final adjustments, oftentimes using a curves adjustment. We'll do this here using a new curves adjustment, and using the auto settings can add a little bit more contrast. And to get the correct settings for this, if you hold down the Alt key on your keyboard, click on the auto settings, what I want to do is enhance the monochrome contrast and snap it to a neutral midtone. Save that as a default so that when you go in and click on auto, it will try and enhance those neutral tones, and it's just added a little bit more contrast to it. And then here it is again. That's the original photograph that I applied the silver effects to. We can get rid of that, and here's our image with or without that last adjustment, and it's looking much better than the original that we started with. It's still not perfect because the original was pretty bad, but you can see here, particularly around the tie, with a little bit of careful processing with the clone tool and being very careful how you replicate the pattern, you can bring it and return it to a really good version of the photograph. That's quite acceptable. But again, we were working from a very poor negative. So we'll have a look now at a couple of other quick examples. Now for our final example, I'm going to use a really poor quality image that was downloaded from the internet. And this particular lady was the fiancée of one of the members of the ill-fated Andrée expedition to the North Pole in 1897. So it's quite an old photograph. This was a JPEG downloaded from the internet. You can see here it's only 600 by 900 pixels, and if we zoom in, it's pretty poor quality. So we're going to look at how we can improve this image and see what we can make of it. And the first thing we're going to do is we go into the develop module, and by right mouse clicking on this, we can go into the enhance option, and what we want is the super resolution option. And what we can see is that what it does is it doubles the pixel resolution in both directions, so it's effectively 4 times the number of pixels, and this does this in a really effective way. So what we'll do is we'll do that, and it will create a new version of the image, and it will be called enhanced DNG. Now you'll see here that once we zoom in on it, this is a horrible mess. It's got a lot of JPEG artifacts in it because it was a low resolution image to start with, but what can we do with this to make it into something more usable? So we'll now move over into Photoshop and have a look and see what we can do to make this image much better. So again, in Photoshop, here's the original file, and you can see that it's a really poor quality, very soft, not much detail at all. But then if we open the enhanced DNG version, you'll see that it's actually improved the file size somewhat, but look at the mess, horrible mess with the JPEG artifacts. What can we do with this? This would be normally an impossible image to work with. But let's see what we can do. Here's my Photoshop version, and you'll see there are a number of steps in this, so we'll step through them fairly quickly, but this is just to give everyone an idea of what's possible to do with the latest tools. Now, we had this problem with the really bad noise and JPEG artifacts. If we took that into the Topaz denoise filter and applied the severe noise to it, wow, what an immediate difference from that to that. And that is using the severe noise filter. There is a slight little bit of artifact around her eyes, but otherwise that's a remarkable difference right from the get-go. But then if we go into the denoise and then add to the Sharpen AI version, what we can do, and it's again use the out of focus very noisy option this time, you'll see that remarkably it's brought back detail, particularly in the hair and around the face. And this is purely using the tools within the Topaz filters. It has brought back a little bit of a highlight line around here, but considering what we started with, this is absolutely remarkable. And so that has brought us a long way, but we can go further. The next thing I did was, the image was fairly dark overall. Not sure what the original was, but I've lightened it quite considerably to try and get it back to a normal tonal range. And then with that curves adjustment, I took it into Nik Silver Efex, and let's just do that quickly. Go into Nik Silver Efex Pro and apply a filter onto it, and I know that I applied the full dynamic smooth filter onto this, and so let's just have a look at how that would work. I have this set as one of my favorites, and I think that's full dynamic smooth, and you'll see here that it's brought out quite a lot of detail, particularly in her blouse and the front here that was just lost in the murk and the mud, and it's enhanced a little bit of the contrast in the hair area and added a little bit of definition to the face area. There's a couple of different options. You can see that some of them are really awful, and the high structure ones really just don't work, but what we want is to try and just enhance that dynamic range, the full dynamic smooth. I'm going to cancel out of that because I already applied this earlier, and here we are, full dynamic smooth. It's brought back some more detail out of these fine areas that you couldn't even see. If we go back to the original image, it was just all a blur, and yet using those couple of steps to bring that back, and then the full dynamic smooth, we've got a lot of detail here already. And going back into using one of my favorite new toys in Photoshop, and that is the neural filters, we can try and see what happens. And this time I'm going to go into the neural filters, and again, getting rid of our Nik menu, I'm going to use the colorize option. Now it's already identified a face in this image. If we flick on the colorize option, it's not perfect, but it's done a reasonable job of applying color. It's identified a face, some eyes, hair color, and it's gone a little bit awry in the background, but it's not too bad. It's a little bit oversaturated for what I want, but what I'm really looking for here is the effect of a hand-painted monochrome image. So we can use this and apply it to the image, and I've already applied this once before, so I'll delete this version and go back to my colorized version, and let me just disable the mask. This is what I came up with just by dropping the saturation back a little bit, but then I decided that the color was a bit wrong down in this bottom part, and I just used a mask on that layer then just to remove the color out of that part and left it around where I wanted. And I think if I click and hold down the Alt key, click on my mask again, I didn't like some of the lipstick effect, and I didn't like some of the effect around her neck. And if I hold down the Alt key again, click on the mask again, takes me back to the image. You can see here that it's done a fairly reasonable job, but it's only put the color in half the hair. So what I do next is I sample the color for this light creamy color, and I've made a fill layer using that color as a selection. I don't know what the color of the blouse was originally, but let's assume that it was something like this. This is a hand colored version after all, and what I've done then is I've just created a new solid fill layer, and how we do that is using the adjustment tools down here. Interestingly, we can do it here by adding a solid color, and then by choosing the hue of the color and the saturation, I can come back with a nice soft color and blend it, and so now we have a nice fill layer. Can't see anything in the image, but what we do is we need to change the blend mode to color, and of course now it has a color over the whole image. I don't want that either, so if I click on the mask and invert the mask, and then by using white paint on the black mask using my brush tool and white, and I need to revert that back to the white color. You'll see now that it is white, and using a small soft edge brush and reasonable opacity, I can just paint that color in, and we're effectively hand painting the image. Now that color's too strong. I won't do this precisely, but for now that color's too strong, so we'll just adjust the opacity back to what we want. So that gives us a little bit of color. Now I've already done that. I'll delete that version of it. Here's my version I made earlier, and it's looking a lot more realistic already. But then I had a problem with the hair, so what I did was I used my eyedropper to sample the brown of the hair, and you'll see that this is the color here that's become the selected color. And again, going back and selecting to make a solid color adjustment layer, that's the color, and again it's created a solid brown fill. We change the blend mode back to color, click on the mask and invert it, and then just simply paint in with our brush tool and adjust the opacity to suit. You can see that that's a little bit strong, so we can just drop that back a little bit. And again, I've made this version earlier, so we'll just delete that version and revert to the one I made earlier. And you can see that you can paint in quite effectively and add the color in, and using a soft edge brush. You don't even have to be super precise because it's going to work fairly well. And here we have now added the color. Now interestingly, you can't create a solid fill layer from the menu here. It's not available. You have to go down to the adjustments menu down at the bottom of the layers panel. But having done all of that, it's looking pretty good, but there's still a few little blotchy images and artifacts left in the image. So I'm going to go back to my old friend, the neural filter, and I'm working now on top of an adjustment layer, and if I try to go into the neural filters, it's not necessarily going to work, but it will now. Click on neural filters. I'm going to cancel out of that. What it normally will want me to do is to make a composite layer. Shift, Control, Alt and E, make a new composite layer. Then you can go into neural filters, and in this case I'm going to then apply that JPEG's artifacts removal again. And this particular filter, as I mentioned before, takes quite a while to process, and it will output to a new layer once it's finished. I'm going to cancel out of this because I've already done this on a previous layer, and let me just dump that in the bin, and I'm just going to turn this back on. What I wanted to do is I just wanted to soften the skin tones, because you could see here there's some blotchy marks. So with this JPEG removal copy, I made a mask because it softened everything, including the eyes, which I really didn't want to do. So I've just masked part of the face, and if I overlay, you'll see here I've just basically painted in, allowed the background to exist, painted in around the face, just so that I get that little bit of softening of the skin tones. And what I'd had left last of all was just a little bit of an issue around the edges of the image and around the edges of the blouse. I made a new blank layer, and then I've cloned around those edges. Now the way we do that, I'll leave that layer off, just make a new blank layer. Here we use our clone tool, and what we do is we blend that to darken, and we make this layer blended to darken. And so when we're sampling the lighter areas, we need to adjust our brush size, and it doesn't always want to do this, so we can just draw it back here. We go back, and firstly we pick a sample point, and then with our clone tool we can just paint that in. And because it's blending to darken, it's only going to darken the lighter areas. It won't affect the darker edges, and so you can clone that in quite simply. And it's only really where you have these highlighted edges that become a little bit of a problem. So that's how we do it, and this is the version I made earlier. So that was the final adjustment. And if we look at this image and we see how this looks compared to the original, it's remarkable what you can do with a little bit of work in the software. We go from that to that using a few tools in Photoshop, Lightroom, and with some plugins. So I hope all of these have been useful. They're really remarkable tools. I'd like you to all give it a try, and if you like this, please give me some comments in the feedback area, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.